What I wish to share with you in this talk are some of the difficulties facing philosophers of literature when thinking about religious poetry, and I'll be talking about Paradise Lost. My intent is not autobiographical, but intellectual. The wall philosophers hit when trying to read Paradise Lost via the same tools that seem so apt in relation to other literature discloses dimensions which render religious poetry unique. So I'm going for the uniqueness through describing to you my failure. Another hoped-for outcropping of the mismatch between theory and literary work is the advantage of a bottom-up approach to the philosophy of literature. Most philosophers of literature that I read are Platonists. They're committed to an up-down approach. They operate conceptually and then illustrate through a literary text. I am, by contrast, an Aristotelian. I work from the textual ground up to abstractions. There is, though, a problem for Aristotelian philosophers of literature. Many of the most persuasive moves within the philosophy of literature focus exclusively on literature written in the last 2 centuries. Typically, these are novels written by secular authors. I, however, happen to teach older literature, much of which is explicitly didactic and religious in orientation. I have come to be convinced that some of what contemporary aestheticians claim regarding the imagination or fiction or literature's ability to provide knowledge requires a different kind of theoretical orientation. The world looks differently when moving from Jane Austen to Spencer, from Wordsworth to Donne, from Dickens to Chaucer, from Coetzee to Dante. For philosophers of literature, to disregard such literary works amounts to ignoring central canonic achievements. If these works do rely, as I believe they do, on a distinct aesthetics, your philosophy of literature will be off. Paradise Lost, I argue in my book, exemplifies poetry which relies upon epistemological and aesthetic assumptions which differ categorically from texts previously discussed. And the differences are all issuing from the concept to which this workshop is devoted to, religion. I will spare you an overview of the current state of the philosophy of literature, the range of issues it deals with, its evolution, internal controversies, etc. I trust that you will not think homogeneity. Rather, you will have in mind an orientation with various currents and undercurrents, sharing the same broad direction. I will tell you, though, its main promise, at least as I see it. At its best, philosophy of literature attempts to explain why we care about literature at all. It sets aside casual reading, the fleeting pleasure and escape literature affords. Instead, it tries to understand a deeper commitment to literature, to its study, to its role in a meaningful life. The best explanation it gives, for me, is that reading a strong literary work in an engaged, inquisitive manner is a gateway to understanding. Understanding isn't the same as knowledge, but I'll ignore this subtlety now. We grow spiritually, intellectually, when reading some works, and we do so in ways that are perhaps unavailable elsewhere. To arrive at some insights as part of reading literature or writing about it does not resemble encountering new information, nor is it similar to being convinced by an argument. What we feel is how pleasure and wisdom-seeking flow into each other. I should now enter extensive qualifications of what I've just said, the terminology involved, the dangers averted, the manner whereby all this gets rigorously defended, the shades in which such cognitivism comes. It's called aesthetic cognitivism. But I will be unguarded, and I will allow this to hover in the air in its crude form. We care for literature because, at pivotal episodes that have made us commit to literature, or at moments that get us to recommit to it, aesthetic and epistemic values interlocked for us. All other values that we find in reading, and there are many, and I don't mean to be reductive, all these other values play second fiddle to growth in awareness. There is, too, a metaphilosophical dimension to the philosophy of literature. It pertains not to literature, but to philosophy and to the pursuit of knowledge. It questions whether the pursuit of understanding built into philosophy's name is broader than conceptual analysis and argumentation. Some philosophers of literature are advocating for this more ambitious field rethinking view. Some don't. But that strand of the issue will remain at the shadows of what I'll be talking about. If experiential wisdom is the promise, the cart driving the philosophy of literature, you may already anticipate why Paradise Lost puts a spoke in its wheels. Milton regards knowledge-seeking gingerly. Philosophy is a term he uses disdainfully. In Christian doctrine, it is always embedded in constructions such as false philosophy or idle philosophy. In Paradise Lost, philosophy is an activity by which the fallen angels while away their time in hell. That's a form of punishment, basically, just to be a philosopher. True, Milton never championed folly, nor did he present reason as a dwarf, as did Spencer. And because he wrote both for and against reason, defending Baconian science in some of his rhetorical exercises as a student, but later writing against it, scholars disagree about his hostility to reason. Stephen Fallon, for example, spots a development in Milton's thinking. Milton, Fallon claims, gravitated towards ever-growing suspicion to reason. He did this not because he had anything against reason. What he opposed, that is what Milton opposed, rather was the implication of reason in the mechanization of nature. That's what Fallon's Milton disliked, hated. Milton did not have to choose between reason and faith. Richard Hooker's pro-reason arguments in his The Laws of Ecclesiastic Policy, made available in England a well-defended corrective to Calvin's anti-reason stance. Drawing on Hooker's position, Deborah Sugar has argued for a finer breakdown of reason. On the one hand, an intellectual reason based on a mind-world separation. On the other hand, which he would have rejected, on the other hand, a participatory consciousness in which one knows reality through a form of reflective agency. So the possibility for a middle way between embracing and vilifying reason was already there, available to Milton. He didn't have to invent it. That still doesn't mean, though, that we know how to confidently place him. We can say this: because Milton devoted his life to study, and because so much of his theology is grounded on arguing for the superiority of one position over another, he couldn't simply trash reason. At the same time, and this is where the philosophy of literature comes in, it seems weak to try to recruit Milton into a form of reading for which literature facilitates knowing or is itself a mode of thinking. Such seems to ignore an essential dimension of the outlook built into his poetry. Thinking, reasoning, knowing, these are all tainted notions, not to be bandied about his great poem, particularly when we keep in mind Milton's subject matter, an episode in which a distorted form of curiosity occasioned a catastrophe. So if a philosopher of literature tries to read Paradise Lost for insights, Milton's ghost will haunt him. The philosopher will awake at night in terror because doorknobs will rattle, the cat will be staring into air, piano keys will be pounded. What Milton brings out instead, in all the episodes in which knowledge is being conveyed in the poem, there are several. Raphael is talking to Adam, Adam to Eve, Michael to Adam. What he brings out in these is that on its own, curiosity lacks value. Curiosity's point is to enrich one's connection with God. The thesis is Paulinian. One's knowledge acquires value when it is embedded in love, when it enables loving God and continuing his work. Knowledge, as Milton intriguingly says at one point in Christian doctrine, is sometimes a mode of action. Knowledge is sometimes a mode of action. In his transactions with Raphael, Adam learns the proper way to be curious. He says, I ask not to satisfy my need to know, this is what he tells Raphael, but in order to be able to magnify God's works more. To further God's work is itself a form of knowing. We see then how Milton instrumentalizes knowledge, and we must realize that the philosopher cannot accept this. A lover of wisdom cannot allow an intrinsically valuable good, wisdom, to demote into a vehicle for something other. We thus arrive at the point of what seems to be an unbridgeable divide between Paradise Lost, or religious orientation as Milton understood it, and contemporary philosophy of literature, or contemporary philosophy, if you like. And there are 5 such divides that I argue about in the book, and I'm going to be talking about 2. Okay, so this is one, about the place of knowledge, whether it's instrumental or not. Because we have learned how to ignore authorial intentions, I considered when I was writing the book whether philosophers can disengage their philosophical reading of the poem from Milton's religious beliefs. Do poetic insights into the makeup of reality retain their status as knowledge claims when they are disconnected from Milton's intent that these realizations be corridors to God? They could, so long as one realizes that Milton differs in his assumptions regarding what realization means, that he would consider such an exercise unwise in its implied assumptions regarding wisdom. This is why it's foundational. So yes, in theory, forcing one's philosophical interpretation in this manner is possible. In practice, though, when you try to do this, and I did, because I had the good theory that worked for Shakespeare, but it didn't work here, okay? You begin reminding yourself disturbingly of Malvolio, trying to force a love note he discovers to refer to himself. So you will note, I hope, that we're reaching the rock bottom of vocational identities, an area of irreconcilable differences, a version of the war between philosophy and poetry which Socrates talked of. Remember, it's a war. It's not a dispute, it's not a discussion, it's not a disagreement, it's a war. Already in the Republic, it was an ancient quarrel, an ancient war. A secular philosophy cannot will her way into bonding with God via an insight acquired as part of a reading. She therefore faces a choice. She could do justice to the poem's experience, but drop her desire to read philosophically for insight. Alternatively, she could persist in the attempt to read for insight, but withdraw from or mischaracterize the poem's experience. A third option, and one which I have taken with some hesitation in that book, is to read the poem precisely as in part a meditation on the points at which philosophy and religious poetry must decouple. Choose any of the 3 paths. What you cannot do is read the poem for insight while trying to also do justice to its experience. You cannot read a poem like this one using the same assumptions that work regarding Beckett or Trollope or Sophocles. And as I said, the inability to do so isn't a problem just for philosophers of literature. If you don't happen to be one, there's no point rubbing your hands in glee. If you're reading the poem for insight, you cannot ignore its insights about insight, its understanding of understanding as a form of connection, not as a standalone achievement. And you cannot ignore how its epistemology determines the feel and the mood that it aims to poetically induce. Okay, so that's one point of disconnection. I will leave knowledge now and switch to the imagination, my second example. So the second and last example of the disconnection between religious poetry and the philosophy of literature. So, here. This is Paradise Lost's opening sentence. I'll just read it. Okay, so this is how you begin. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with one loss of Eden till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat, sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb, or of Sinai, didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heaven and earth rose out of chaos, Or if Zion Hill delights thee more, and Shiloah's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God. I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Ionian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet, in prose or rhyme. Even if your love for Milton is without bounds, it will be hard for you not to sympathize with the first-time reader of the poem. A bucket of cold water is harshly thrown upon sparks of enthusiasm. It's not funny. I'm describing a tragedy. My book on Milton begins with a sentence, I read Paradise Lost late and I hated it immediately, or something like that. And I think I was really proud of that sentence. That was the initial feel. Later it turned to a wholly other set of emotions. The sentence is convoluted, its phrases indelicate, its images alienating. Most of us will need to look up several words and locations before we can gulp down such fare, and we cannot be blamed if we wonder whether we should bother. This is not the kind of poetry that seduces us to disarm, to withdraw, to converse with ourselves in less visited haunts of our minds. Instead, Milton's Zion's hills, Shiloah's brook, or his Ionian mount charge at us like armored steeds. We tense up. We have the dispiriting feeling that someone is trying to improve us. Partly responsible for the alienating quality of the sentence is the overarching sublimity which the poem aims to occasion. This isn't poetry whose primary objective is to get you to feel as who and what you are now, but as part of an elevated experience. But because, being the opening sentence, such elevation has not yet occurred, the line cannot but fly over the head of the poem's first-time reader. This negative judgment will change though once we consider the particular role the imagination plays in religious poetry. Okay, so it's an aesthetic failure until you think about how imagination works, particularly in relation to religion. Here too, a glimpse into the poem's resistance to subjecting itself to the philosopher of literature's standard tools exposes the uniqueness of religious poetry. What the philosopher of literature typically attempts is to model imagination on travel. You have to take my word for it that this is what people do. And it succeeds. It is claimed that the imagination enables an experiencing and a knowing that are unavailable in one's quotidian reality. Literary imaginings accordingly become rewarding visitations to some other mindscape. After being enriched, go through various forms of experiencing something else, you return with various gains. Like a traveler, you are leaving home, this kind of Tzachi, okay, the non-imagined reality, and are going away, I don't know, being Antigone, imagined content, and returning home to what is really here. But that's not necessarily the way in which the imagination functions within religious thinking. Okay? I'm giving two quotes here. Hope you can see this, but I'll read them anyway. So these are claims about how the imagination works in religion, what is distinct to it. Faith is not simply a matter of giving assent to a number of doctrinal propositions, but of entering with the whole personality into a different imaginative world. This is what faith is. You enter into an imaginative world with your whole personality, not just the head, with the emotions, with feelings, with tactile emotions, with the spaces you surround yourself in when you're in a church or a synagogue or whatever. Second quotation, theology is essentially a constructive work of the human imagination, an expression of the imagination's activity, helping to provide orientation for human life through developing a symbolic picture of the world. Okay, again, it's imaginative activity. It's an expression of imaginative activity. What these positions seek to convince us of is that the imagination in religion is not in contrast with reality, but that it is reality. You don't leave what is really real, the real Tzachi, going over into fantasy land and then come back. What you're meant to achieve is rather an ability to keep on imagining. For only by imagining do you access what is really real. And when you stop imagining, then you fall into falsehood. Your reality is structured around a meaning-giving narrative. This narrative needs to be imagined. And once you do this, the narrative tells you what you are pained by. Once you do this, the narrative tells you that what you are pained by now is caused by a chain of events leading back to original sin and previously to Satan's rebellion. All this is supposed to be immediate. You get diagnosed with a horrible disease, and you'll be thinking Adam, Eve, and Satan. The imagined narrative you're trying to weave yourself into isn't some optional story. It is a sense-making machine. If you're Milton, it tells you why 2 of your children have died. It tells you why you are blind. If Paradise Lost subscribes to such a view of the imagination, its rhetoric will attempt not to provide readers with importable realizations. Rather, it will pull them into an imaginary world which they would not wish to leave. Whatever is imagined is in some sense true. Even if it's material added to the Bible, say Eve's looking at her reflection in the pool, it becomes part of one's meaning-making. Imaginings are, thus, not a move away from reality, but a form of entering it. Moreover, to imagine is not merely to mentally spectate, as if one is shutting one's eyes and looking at a scene. To imagine is sometimes to perform something. You put on an attitude. You try it out, as it were. Some philosophers writing about the imagination in recent decades have been developing this idea. Tamar Gendler, Jose Medina, Richard Moran, that did something performative about the imagination. But for Milton's readers, the performative nature of the imagination would have been familiar. What were, after all, Loyola's spiritual exercises but guided imaginary performances promising spiritual amelioration? Imagine that you're talking to Christ, Loyola would urge his reader. Imagine that your teacher is St. Peter. To do this doesn't amount merely to seeing something in the mind's eye. Rather, it means performing something. Imagining becomes a self-constituting form of agency. We can now return to Paradise Lost's opening sentence and reassess a first reader's resistance to its alienating surface. Milton is setting up a contract with his readers. He demands that they enter an imaginary world. The remote biblical names are hurdles. If these are overcome, the reader is situated in an imaginary landscape which is not removed from reality but is reality. To imagine is to be, is to know. A religious poet's task is to provide the scaffolding that enables this to occur. Do that, and like Adam, you will be walking as if God is accompanying you. To the philosopher's dismay, instead of knowledge being a move away from what one imagines, counterfactuals become wisdom. You are living a life of as if. Current philosophy of the imagination provides some relevant close distinctions. While these distinctions make room for a connection between imagination and truth, they do not capture the uniqueness of religious imaginings. Amy Kind has distinguished between instructive and transcendent uses of the imagination. The former use imaginative engagements in order to teach something. They thereby link the imagination to truth. So Elwood, that's a character in Colson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys, for example, imagines sometimes that he's talking to Martin Luther King. Elwood receives guidance from such imaginative exercises, so these would be instructive. Note, though, the difference between an instructive imaginative exercise, in which the imagining is a means to an end, and the far more comprehensive invitation to remain absorbed in an imaginary state. Milton's Adam is not merely counterfactually conversing with God, but doing this as part of a complete subordination of life to an imaginary narrative. A different distinction, by Dustin Stokes, sets apart productive and reproductive imaginings. The former freely create. That's when you compose a fiction or something. The latter, the reproductive ones, summon to the mind something not present to it. Unlike memory, what reproductive imaginings represents was never present. It did nevertheless take place. Here too, the imagination is not a break from truth. And this distinction is relevant to some contexts in the philosophy of literature, because some literature is devoted to imaginatively recreate a past atrocity as a kind of moral homage paid to the past. Toni Morrison's Beloved falls into this category, as does the poem cycle Zong by Nubesis Phillips, or Percival Everett's The Trees. There are other examples. The reading experience in such works involve imaginative immersion, connected to a historical truth, to some awful thing that took place, and to present identity, because it forms me. It forms me or reforms me as a present reader. Literature becomes a walk of mourning and an identity-forming aesthetic entity. Now, is that the same as what Milton is doing? No. Although such commemorative identity shaping differs from broader aspiration, Although such commemorative identity shaping differs from the broader aspiration of religious imagining, The difference, again though, such commemorative identity shaping differs from the broader aspirations of religious imaginings. That's how I should have read this. The recreative imaginings above are event-oriented. You are to encounter a forgotten event vividly. So Seth and what happened between her and her daughter in Beloved. By engaging with it in the here and now, you will transform by engaging with that event. Religious imaginings, on the other hand, are not event-driven. The events they describe, and they certainly describe some events, are aspects of a greater immersion in an imaginative world in which one is watched by imaginary entities, converses with them, imagines what they would say and do, etc. So events are part of this, but they're not the whole thing. I'm summing up. I've been presenting two areas of misalliance between the philosophy of literature and religious poetry. I focused on knowledge and the imagination. I was addressing you as a philosopher of literature who has written on Shakespeare and, when writing a book about Milton, has found it futile and misguided to employ the same theoretical moves in relation to Paradise Lost. Through tracing such failure, the uniqueness of religious poetry is being tapped. The manner whereby religious poetry gets us to imagine or to know is special. So special, in fact, that it compels you to subject yourself to its own vocabulary. I also suggested that even if you could rephrase the poem's idiom into an irreligious one, it's not a vocabulary that you would wish to translate. If poetry is that which is lost through translation, religious poetry is that which is lost when transcoded into secular ways of meaning-making. Ironically, we learn something philosophically when we work out why the poem slips through the philosopher's clutch like sand. Thank you.